I did not reject the offer because I enjoy confrontation. I rejected it because some compromises destroy more than they build.
Ibrahim Traoré. Imagine a letter folded neatly, quietly, delivered through diplomatic channels, not with threats, but promises. Infrastructure funding, security assistance, and development partnerships. $1 billion package carefully written to reward silence. But silence is not what it received. Instead, that letter ended up on national television, held high by a young African leader with calm defiance. His words were simple, clear, and unforgettable. Burkina Faso is not a subcontractor of foreign powers. That broadcast did more than break protocol. It stirred something deeper across Africa and beyond, not just headlines, but hearts. A moment of public refusal became a symbol of sovereignty. A single voice interrupted a global script that had long expected quiet compliance. This is not a rumor. This is the true account of what happened when a proposal intended to shift policy sparked a continent-wide conversation instead. About power, about values, about what cannot be bought. And now the world watches. Not just for what was refused, but for what that refusal revealed. If you still believe sovereignty should mean something not just for one nation, but for all, stay with us. Because this story will not be covered in the evening news. Long before the letter was opened, the script had already been written, not by Africa, but about Africa. For decades, the global stage saw African nations as recipients, not writers. Invitations came with conditions. Development aid often arrived tied to quiet agreements. Stay aligned. Don't criticize. Sign here. Israel, like many nations seeking partnerships across the continent, had grown its diplomatic and economic ties across Africa through health initiatives, technology cooperation, and security programs. In public, these relationships were framed as mutual development. In private, however, they sometimes carried expectations, including political discretion, on global matters. Burkina Faso's history tells a more complex story. Once under the weight of colonial legacy, it became one of the world's poorest nations by income and one of the richest by resilience. For decades, it relied heavily on foreign aid and military assistance. In times of need, loans came. So did debt. Aid arrived. So did policy constraints. But something changed in late 2022. A 34-year-old captain named Ibrahim Traoré emerged not just as a transitional head of state, but as a leader with a voice that didn't echo the usual script. He began reducing military dependence, nationalizing mineral assets, and calling openly for African unity based on mutual respect. To some, these moves were bold. To others, disruptive. Then came the letter reportedly offering $1.2 billion in support from Israel in exchange for quieting criticism of its foreign policy. In many places, such a deal might have been accepted silently. But Traoré didn't respond silently. Instead, he chose to share it, too. In a world where backroom diplomacy often avoids daylight, his decision was unprecedented. He did not name or condemn. He simply showed the letter and said, "We cannot accept assistance that asks us to change our conscience." That moment drew a line. For many in Burkina Faso and across West Africa, it was the first time they saw a leader publicly prioritize principle over partnership, not to embarrass another country, but to affirm a growing belief that Africa has the right to decide its future out loud. And so, a continent long spoken about began perhaps for the first time to be heard. The letter was no ordinary communication. Drafted in formal diplomatic language, it offered what appeared to be an extraordinary opportunity, a $1.2 billion package from Israel, aimed at boosting infrastructure, enhancing security cooperation, and offering development assistance to Burkina Faso, a country in need facing complex challenges. But there was a condition. Embedded in its phrasing was a gentle request, one that carried significant weight: reduces public criticism of Israeli foreign policy, particularly in West Africa, and soften rhetorical positions in regional platforms. For many, such an offer might have seemed practical, even generous. But for Ibrahim Traoré, it posed a choice not of policy, but of principle. He could have quietly declined. He could have negotiated a revision. Instead, he did something rarely seen in the world of diplomacy. He went public. In a nationally televised address, he stood behind a wooden podium with the flag of Burkina Faso to his right and his people before him. Calmly, without raising his voice, he held the letter high and read its key lines aloud. Then he paused, looked into the camera and said, "Burkina Faso is not a subcontractor of foreign powers. We will not trade loyalty for concessions. Our dignity is not negotiable." The moment echoed far beyond the room. Within hours, the phrase "Africa is not for sale" began trending across 14 African countries. On TikTok, Instagram, and encrypted messaging apps, young people began resharing the video with music overlays, street interviews, and animated tributes. Artists painted murals in Ouagadougou, while university students debated the speech in open-air forums. What was once a quiet diplomatic outreach became a continent-wide conversation. This was not rejection for rejection's sake. The broadcast did not speak in anger. It spoke in alignment with the sentiment of a generation growing more aware of its place in global affairs. In neighboring Mali and Niger governments, who had also begun distancing themselves from former colonial partnerships, announced formal reviews of all foreign contracts involving Israeli firms. Chad temporarily withdrew its ambassador from Tel Aviv. In South Africa, where debate around international policy is often intense, parliamentary members praised Traoré's stance as a model of transparent leadership. But what made the moment historic was not only the political ripple effect, it was the public clarity. African diplomacy has long been conducted in private rooms with closed doors. In many cases, public opinion followed after decisions were already made. This time it was reversed. A decision was made in public with the people as witnesses. And this had consequences. Within Burkina Faso, the response was swift and visceral. Handmade signs appeared in marketplaces reading, "Dignity has no price." Young poets began writing verses inspired by the speech. A local hip-hop group sampled the audio into a protest anthem that hit 1 million streams in 2 days. In cafes and classrooms, the conversation wasn't just about geopolitics. It was about self-worth. One teacher in Bobo Dioulasso told her students, "What you saw on TV is not just politics. It's identity. It's what it means to walk tall even when others think you should kneel." For the middle-class engineers, traders, and entrepreneurs who had grown weary of seeing foreign aid come and go with little effect, the letter symbolized something more than a headline. It marked a threshold. A leader had invited them not to guess what was happening behind the scenes, but to see it firsthand and judge for themselves. And they did. Taxi drivers quoted Traoré's lines to passengers. Street vendors named new dishes after him. A local clothing line sold out of shirts printed with "Not for sale" in French and Moray. Internationally, the impact was equally telling. While officials in Israel convened emergency discussions to recalibrate their Africa outreach strategy, media outlets in Europe and North America took notice. Some headlines called the move bold, others labeled it divisive. But across all reactions, one thing was clear: the rules had shifted. What was intended to be a private arrangement had become a public benchmark, not for hostility, but for honesty. And in that honesty, something stirred, not just in Burkina Faso, but across a continent that had too often been spoken to rather than listened to. In choosing to read that letter aloud, Traoré wasn't just rejecting a proposal. He was rewriting the posture of African diplomacy. He didn't raise his fist. He didn't call for confrontation. He simply placed the truth where all could see it and let the people decide what it meant. The televised address wasn't just watched, it was felt. Across Burkina Faso and far beyond the moment, Ibrahim Traoré held up the letter and spoke those measured words, sent a wave of recognition through living rooms, market stalls, university halls, and smartphone screens. Something unusual had happened. A page turned not only in diplomacy, but in expectation. For generations, foreign policy had been the realm of closed sessions, quiet nods and press releases that spoke only in generalities. In many parts of Africa, foreign influence arrived in the form of development projects, security agreements, or aid packages often discussed far from public scrutiny. Citizens were informed of decisions after the ink had dried. This time, that pattern broke. Traoré's choice to publicly share the letter was more than a gesture of transparency. It was a redefinition of accountability. The public didn't just learn what was offered, they saw why it was refused, and they were given a voice in the aftermath. Within 48 hours, regional and international responses began to crystallize. In Mali and Niger, both nations that had recently revised their defense arrangements with former colonial powers officials, announced immediate reviews of foreign contracts involving Israeli-linked firms. In Chad, the response was more symbolic, but no less serious. The ambassador to Israel was recalled, a rare diplomatic move that signaled more than disagreement. It signaled principle. South Africa, which had already taken public positions on issues of international justice, praised Burkina Faso by name in parliamentary debate. One member of parliament put it clearly: "What the young president has shown is not defiance for defiance's sake, but the courage to be transparent." But the larger shift was not limited to governments. On the streets, in schools, and homes, the event resonated deeply. In Ouagadougou, murals appeared overnight, colorful, bold, and personal. One showed Traoré holding the letter like a torch illuminating a dark room. The words beneath it read, "Our future is not for bargaining." In Ghana, artists turned the moment into protest songs shared through Bluetooth and cloud drives. In Senegal, student groups printed the letter and held public readings on campuses. The symbolism wasn't abstract. It was grounded in a lived reality, a shared awareness that too many decisions had been made without the people. The reaction wasn't anger. It was reflection. In conversations across West Africa, the letter was discussed not only as a political artifact, but as a question of values. Why had it taken so long for this kind of transparency to emerge? And what would happen if more leaders followed suit in Burkina Faso? Traoré took his message further. Days after the broadcast, he visited a university in Bobo-Dioulasso. No teleprompters, no scripted speech, just a handheld microphone and a hall full of students. He spoke softly at first, thanking them for their attention. Then his voice sharpened with sincerity. "We were told to accept what is given and stay silent. But the world is changing, so I ask you, should we go back to silence, or do we speak louder?" The response, a roar of applause, filled the room, the hallway, the street outside. But this wasn't just youthful enthusiasm. It was an awakening. For many students, it was the first time they felt invited into a national decision. For market vendors, it was the first time they saw a leader choose dignity over diplomacy as usual. And the impact stretched further. In Nigeria, media debates broke out over the role of aid and accountability. In Kenya, civic groups issued public letters calling for the publication of all foreign agreements. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, student unions demanded transparency in mining contracts, invoking Traoré's speech as a model. Even in capitals where strong alliances with Western or Middle Eastern powers remained intact, conversations shifted. People asked harder questions. They looked more closely at what was offered and at what was asked in return. Meanwhile, in Tel Aviv, the tone was markedly different. Reports from within Israel's foreign ministry suggested deep frustration. What was meant as a confidential outreach had turned into a public spectacle. According to regional analysts, the concern wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was about precedent. If one letter could be read on national television, what would stop another Western think tanks in Washington and Brussels echoed this anxiety. They published rapid assessments warning that public diplomacy, when handled with sincerity and confidence, could shift the balance of negotiation away from traditional power centers. But perhaps the most powerful effect was the simplest clarity. Traoré's action reminded the world that diplomacy need not be hidden. That offers, even generous ones, should be weighed not only by economic terms, but by their moral cost. And that the people, when informed, can understand complexity and make judgments for themselves. It wasn't confrontation, it was conversation. And in that conversation, a different kind of power emerged, the power of visibility, of shared dignity, of open leadership. The news moved quickly, but the response moved even faster. Within days of the televised address, the story that began in Burkina Faso became a continental conversation. It wasn't just about one leader or one letter anymore. It was about how a generation viewed power partnership and pride. In West Africa, governments took notice. Mali and Niger, both led by transitional authorities prioritizing national control over foreign dependency, issued formal announcements. All contracts involving external actors, particularly those connected to infrastructure or minerals, would be subject to public review. While not explicitly linked to Traoré's speech, the timing spoke for itself. In Ghana, members of parliament brought forward questions about the nature of recent aid agreements. They asked whether development partnerships had included any clauses that could compromise the nation's right to speak freely on global matters. Civil society organizations echoed the call, demanding more transparent governance and better public access to international contracts. In Nigeria, the debate spread across television and radio. Talk show hosts asked their audiences, should we continue to accept assistance if it asks us to stay quiet? Callers from Lagos to Kano shared thoughts that might not have been voiced a year ago. Some spoke about self-reliance, others about the need to rethink what real partnership means. The energy was respectful, but resolute. Even in nations that had maintained strong ties with Israel and Western countries, the tone began to shift. Not in opposition, but in openness. There was a growing consensus foreign support should come with mutual respect, not quiet expectations. Back in Burkina Faso, the mood was unlike anything seen in recent memory. Public squares filled not with protest, but with presence. Citizens gathered for conversations, community forums and art installations reflecting the moment. In Ouagadougou's Central Plaza, a youth collective unveiled a large wooden installation shaped like an open envelope. Inside it, a message was carved in 3 languages, French Moray and English. Our silence is not for sale. Across the country, local radio programs began broadcasting roundtable discussions about dignity in foreign policy. Teachers introduced the televised letter into civic education classes. In rural villages, mobile theaters replayed the broadcast and held discussions afterward. But the impact wasn't just cultural, it was psychological. For many citizens, especially young people, it was the first time they felt directly involved in a global decision. Not as an audience, but as stakeholders. The letter had become more than an object. It was a mirror reflecting the questions people had carried quietly for years. What are we giving up when we take aid with conditions? What does self-determination really look like? The reaction wasn't uniform. Some economic experts expressed concern about potential fallout. Could public rejection lead to financial isolation? Would needed development funds be harder to secure? Traoré's administration acknowledged these risks, but also emphasized a broader goal to build partnerships, grounded in transparency, not dependency. And for many, the risks were worth the message. At a university forum in Bobo Dioulasso, a student stood up during a Q&A session and said, "We know development is not free, but we want to be part of the conversation. We want to be treated not as recipients, but as equals. That comment drew applause, not for its emotion, but for its honesty. In Kenya, civil society groups began advocating for a policy of full public disclosure of all foreign loan agreements. In Tanzania, student organizations hosted panels comparing different African approaches to foreign investment. And in the Democratic Republic of Congo, open letters to Parliament requested an audit of all foreign mining contracts signed in the last 5 years. It was not protest, it was participation, a wave of civic engagement inspired not by anger, but by clarity. Across the continent, the feeling was shared. If one nation could say no, others could ask questions. If one leader could be transparent, others could be encouraged to follow. What began as a moment of refusal became a movement of reflection. It didn't require confrontation. It required confidence. And slowly, a new understanding of leadership began to take root, not just leadership by titles or treaties, but leadership by trust, leadership that invites its people not only to follow, but to see, to ask, and to believe. For decades, power in diplomacy was measured by what could be offered quietly. The larger the grant, the quieter the conversation. The more complex the agreement, the less the public knew. But Ibrahim Traoré's decision changed that equation. By sharing the letter openly, a document offering over $1 billion in assistance in exchange for reduced criticism, Burkina Faso disrupted more than a conversation. It shifted the strategy, not only for one nation, but for an entire continent. The message was not rejection for its own sake. It was realignment. Traoré signaled that future partnerships must be built not only on investment and aid, but on shared respect. That development should not come at the price of discretion. That sovereignty, to be meaningful, must include the right to speak freely and be heard. This single act forced policymakers worldwide to consider a new possibility. What happens when African nations begin setting the tone? In Washington and Brussels, policy analysts moved quickly. Think tanks like the Brookings Institution and Carnegie Endowment published memos identifying a trend they called moral leverage. In short, the ability of smaller nations to gain global credibility through ethical consistency, even in the face of economic cost. For years, Western influence across Africa had relied on economic support, humanitarian outreach, and security training. These were often genuine efforts to build partnership. But Traoré's act asked a deeper question. Are these relationships built on shared values or silent expectations? The ripple effects made it clear. If one letter could spark a continental conversation, then transparency itself had become a kind of power. This marked the beginning of what some diplomats called the Ouagadougou effect, a new dynamic where exposing the terms of foreign engagement could influence outcomes more than accepting them. In this model, the public isn't the last to know. They're part of the process, and that changes everything. Across Africa, leaders began reviewing not only what deals were being offered, but how they were being discussed. Public opinion became a factor in foreign relations, not just domestic policy. The people had seen the letter, they had heard the speech, they knew what was at stake, and they began to ask, if this could happen in Burkina Faso, what's happening here? The moral leverage Traoré demonstrated extended far beyond his borders. In Latin America and Southeast Asia, commentators drew comparisons between Burkina Faso's transparency and their own histories with conditional aid. Editorials in Argentina and Indonesia referenced Traoré's speech as a blueprint for a new kind of engagement, one that prioritizes dignity without rejecting cooperation. But nowhere was the shift more visible than in Africa itself. Diplomacy was no longer a quiet exchange between ministries. It had entered public squares, classrooms, music studios, and digital platforms. The language of foreign policy, once limited to economic terms, now included cultural values and civic participation. And this shift gave African nations something many had sought for generations: agency. Agency doesn't always mean walking away. Sometimes it means having the freedom to ask better questions before signing. In meetings that followed Traoré's address, ministers from Mali, Niger, and Guinea proposed drafting a regional transparency charter, a document that would outline basic expectations for how foreign agreements should be communicated to the public. The idea was simple: if citizens bear the cost or benefit of these deals, they deserve to know the terms. This was not about isolation. It was about integrity. And it created something unexpected: leverage, not through wealth, but through wisdom. For international partners, this shift was both a challenge and an invitation. It challenged the tradition of quiet diplomacy, but invited a new era of partnership based on openness. It meant that foreign investors would need to answer not just to host governments, but to the people who lived with the consequences. For some, this felt risky. For others, it felt overdue. Traoré's stand also clarified another point. African nations are not rejecting the world. They are asking to meet it as equals. And in doing so, they're not stepping away from the global stage. They're stepping forward. The new leverage isn't loud. It doesn't demand or disrupt. It offers a different kind of strength, one built on truth-telling, clarity, and trust. In a world where global headlines often focus on conflict or crisis, the act of holding up a letter and saying, "Let the people see," became a form of quiet courage. And in that courage, Africa found not just a voice, but a vantage point, a place from which to ask, if dignity is the new diplomacy, what kind of world do we want to build together? You remember the moments that mattered: the March on Washington, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of apartheid, times when ordinary people stood up not with power in their hands, but with conviction in their hearts. So ask yourself now, what does it mean when a young leader from a country few headlines mention holds up a letter and simply says, "Let the people see"? This is not about politics. It's about principle. It's about a generation in Africa choosing to speak openly, not in defiance, but in dignity. About citizens asking to be informed, not controlled. And about a new kind of leadership that refuses to trade its voice for silence, no matter the price. Across oceans and decades, there is a familiar echo here. You remember Watergate. You remember COINTELPRO. You remember what it felt like to ask hard questions when it wasn't easy. So today, a young leader named Ibrahim Traoré stands before the world with a similar question. If dignity costs too much, what are we really buying? He is not asking for applause. He is asking for honesty from his partners, from his people, and perhaps from us all. If you still believe that leadership begins with integrity, if you still believe that voices matter, then this moment is not foreign. It is familiar, and it's worth remembering. Share this story, not because it's perfect, but because it's true, and because it reminds us the quiet courage to speak up is still the loudest sound in a just world.